Alrighty, so welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning into my webinar. For you that don't know, my name is Jaquise Smith, and I'm one of the community preventionists here at Call for Help. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce myself and then make like a few little announcements about the webinar. So like I said, I'm one of the community preventionists here. The other one is Cheyenne. She has some content that was put out earlier in the month. So basically our job is to go to different schools, different church groups, different community organizations, and we educate the public on what sexual assault is and what resources we have for victims and survivors. So we're mainly in schools. We work from grades pre-K all the way up to teams in high school. We have different curriculums. So for the younger kids, pre-K through fifth grade, we start very simple. We just teach them about what a safe touch is, what an unsafe touch is, and what you should do if someone is trying to touch you in an unsafe way, and who are some people that you guys can tell about it. But once they get older, in middle school, we start to shift to something that's a little bit more relevant to them. So we'll start talking about healthy relationships and dating violence, what to do if you're in an unhealthy relationship, what are the warning signs of an unhealthy relationship, and different ways you can get help. And then by the time that they get to high school, we'll still work with them on healthy relationships, but we'll really start working on consent and more deep topics within sexual assault, just so they have a better understanding of it. So yeah, that's pretty much what we do in schools. For the community, we just educate the community and how the best we can. We do different things. It's kind of a you know go with the flow type thing, working with community. So me specifically, what I mostly do for community is I work with the Latino Roundtable of Southwestern Illinois. And it's basically just a group of different like businesses and social services agencies that really want to bring more resources to the Latino community. Um, so I do a lot with them. A lot of the things have been stopped because of the COVID situation, um, but I'm looking forward to getting back into the community once everything's over. So yeah, that's pretty much me. The topic today, as you can see, is going to be about underrepresented survivors. So I have two quick things to say about the presentation before I dive into it. The first one is sometimes I might use the word survivors or victims. Um, at Call for Help, we're considered victim-centered, um, survivor-centered. Sorry, I switched them already. We're survivor-centered, so that means we do whatever we can to make sure that the survivors' needs are being met throughout any situation they come across. So one of the things is we call them survivors instead of victims. Survivor is a more empowering term, so that's why we like to use it. But we'll use victims sometimes, mainly because in like legal jargon and like anything related to like criminal justice, that's the term that's used. So anytime we're talking about like laws or like the court system or something like that, we'll most likely use victims. And then the second thing I want to point out, uh, in this presentation, I have two videos, but technology has not been on our side lately. So the audio in the videos has been like kind of warped and not really like working right. Um, so we can get to those points. I'll just like give a brief synopsis of what happens in the video. And then in the Facebook post, in the comments, we'll put the links to the videos. They're both on YouTube, so pretty easy to find. Alrighty then, so let's get started. Okay, so we're talking about underrepresented survivors. So what do we mean about underrepresented survivors? Basically, it's going to be the people that we don't automatically think about when we start talking about the topic of sexual assault. So if you talk to like most people, if you ask them like what they think like a survivor of sexual assault would look like, most people would probably imagine Probably like a young woman, usually white, usually always heterosexual, and usually young and thin. So that's pretty much become like the dominant narrative of what it means to be a survivor or a victim of any type of sexual violence. But we know that's not the case. Not every single person who is a survivor of sexual assault is like a white woman, a straight white woman, or any combination of those characteristics. Um, and one thing that I want to reiterate, like while talking about this is not to invalidate the experiences of white women who are victims of sexual assault or survivors of sexual assault. All their experiences are valid. We're not trying to diminish it or discredit them in any way, but we really want to bring attention to the other people who may not be getting the attention that they deserve. So yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about. This notion, this dominant narrative that we have of victims and survivors of sexual assault is something that comes from like media, from society, just different things in the world that have conditioned us to think in a certain way. Um, and then throughout this presentation, I'll be going through like different groups that people may not automatically think of when the topic of sexual assault comes up. Okay. All right. So here's this first video. Like I said, these videos are all on YouTube. This video is for the first group that I'm going to be talking about. So if you go on YouTube, it's just, here's the title right here: Survivors of Sexual Abuse and Assault Reveal an Important Message. Got cut off, but that's what it is. So basically what happens in this video is they bring in 6 women and they each give these women a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper it has the story from a different survivor of sexual assault or sexual abuse. So they just ask them to read it out loud, and then they ask them like how they felt about it. So everyone goes through, they read it, and they say, how does this make you feel? Like, what was on your mind when you were thinking about this? A lot of people were saying things like, I can't believe like this could happen to someone. It's really sad that, this is something that's like a real life thing for some people. Um, and then one of the questions specifically is, what would you tell this person if they were here right now? Um, and a lot of the women in there, they say that they use the pronoun she, like she or her. I would just tell her that like she's loved and everything will be okay, and like we're here to support her. And then after they bring out the survivors, and they all happen to be men. Um, so I really like this video, because it shows that men can be survivors of sexual assault. Typically, people think that they are the perpetrators, which in most cases, men tend to be the perpetrators, but they can also be the victims and the survivors. Um, and this video is really good at demonstrating that. One thing I really, really like about this video is the diversity of the survivors. You have like older survivors, you have younger survivors, you have them from different racial and ethnic groups, different sexual orientations. So it really encompasses like everyone's lived experience, and not just like one single story. So you should definitely check out this video. It's very good. Yeah, so then we're talking about male survivors. So there are a lot of men that are victims and survivors of sexual assault, but it's something that's not really like talked about that much. As you can tell from the statistics, millions of men have been in the United States have been victims of rape. Um, as of 1998, 2.78 million men in the U.S. have been victims of attempted or completed rape. Um, Yeah, so there's this statistic that 1 in 6 boys will be a victim of sexual abuse in their lives. So we know that, but people aren't really talking about like men being survivors of sexual assault that often. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. Men are traditionally told that they are the stronger sex, that they can't show weakness, And we've somehow equated sexual assault with being something that happens to weak people. So then there's this like stigma if a man says like, oh, like this happened to me, people are automatically going to think he's weak. He can't provide for himself or for others, which is totally untrue. Um, and then yeah, so it's just like they aren't allowed to like ask for the help that they may need. Everyone needs help. It doesn't matter like if you're man, woman, child, whatever. Everyone's going to need help at sometimes. But men have been conditioned to just like help themselves and not seek outside help. It also goes into the myth that men can't be raped. Anybody can be raped. Being raped is being forced to have like sexual intercourse or like do sexual things with someone. So if you don't want it, then it's automatically rape. Like there's nothing to say about it. So that can happen to men too. Uh, there's this like notion that men are supposed to always want sex, and if they don't want sex, then something's wrong, and they're supposed to enjoy the sex. But that's not true. They have like we have normal emotions just like anybody else. So men can be raped, and it's something that hasn't been like alleviated so that we can get the proper help for that. I will say though, in my experience, like working here, I've seen that um, a lot more attention has been given to like younger men or like boys specifically, little kids, and that may be because people think that because they're kids, they're not as strong as they will be like when they're adults yet. So like we obviously have to help them. But then that same grace isn't extended to adult male survivors. So that's something that we should be very conscious of and making sure that um, those people, everyone who needs help from sexual abuse or sexual assault is getting. All right. So then we're going to go on to our next group, and that's going to be racial and ethnic minorities. So before we get into the statistics and everything about that, there's some vocabulary that we definitely need to go over before we start talking about it. And that's the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So in my experience, a lot of people, especially with race and ethnicity, they think they're the same thing, but they're not. They're two totally different things. So race describes the physical characteristics that define a person as being a member of a specific group. So what I like to tell people is race is it's not really biology, but it's how people appear biologically or physically. So this would be like your skin color. So when we talk about race, the big ones are white or Caucasian, black or of African descent, um, Asian, and then there's the one for Middle Eastern, which sometimes it's kind of confusing. Sometimes Middle Eastern can be considered like a subcategory of like white, so it gets kind of confusing. But the main ones are that we talk about in the United States uh, would be white, black, and then Asian. Um, and then we go over to ethnicity. So this one's very important because people mess this up all the time. So ethnicity refers to the cultural characteristics that define a person as being a member of a specific group. So it's all about culture, not like your physical appearance. Um, that is why Latino or Hispanic is actually not a race, actually an ethnicity, because that's a term that was pretty much just created to talk about people who come from Spanish speaking countries. So Latin America, Central America, South America, countries in the Caribbean. It also extends to Brazil, where they speak Portuguese, and also Haiti, because all of those are like Latin influence uh, languages that they speak in those countries. So that's something very important to realize. People think that, Latino Hispanic is a race. It's not. And then there's nationality. And nationality is a bit more understood than the other two. So nationality is the status of belonging to a particular nation. So that just means holding citizenship in a certain nation. So like me, for example, I was born and raised in the United States, so I am an American citizen. My nationality is U.S. American. If I had been born in like Spain or somewhere, then my nationality would be Spanish. But with these three things, you could have a combination of all three things, and it could be different. So you could be someone who is black and your ethnicity is Latin American, but you live in, say, like England or something. Um, these are all like, it can be like all mixed together. So it's something that we shouldn't confuse when we're talking about these sorts of things. All right, and then here are just some statistics that I found regarding race and ethnicity in regards to sexual assault. So the big thing we see is it says while 80% of rapes are reported by white women, women of color are more likely to be assaulted than white women. So we see that white women tend to um, report more, um, but people of color are being affected by it more. And then on the side, another side, you can see the statistics for um, those who are affected, the amount of people who are affected by it in each group. Um, so that you see that Asian Pacific Islander and Hispanic Latina, um, those are the lowest throughout the spectrum. And then you see that white and black are almost at the same rate, but black is higher. And then you go down and you see that Native American, Alaskan Native, that is the highest one. So we're going to be talking about that. So in regards to race and sexual assault, the most at-risk population is in the United States is Native Americans. Um, and it's a group that we don't normally think about when we talk about these things, or really anything. Um, and I think a lot of it has to do, especially where we are in the country, there isn't a significant population of Native Americans in like St. Louis, southwestern Illinois area. So I think we just kind of forget about this group. Uh, but as you can see, they are really at risk for sexual assault. So you can see that on average, Native Americans aged 12 and older experience 5,900 sexual assaults per year. And something that's very interesting that I found out uh, doing this research about Native Americans and sexual assault is that a lot of the sexual assault that's committed against them is committed by a stranger. Um, and when you look at the other races, it's the opposite. Usually, someone that commits sexual violence against someone is someone that the person knows. But for Native Americans, it turns out that it's a complete stranger. So that's something that, like I was shocked to find about. I work in this, in this field, and I didn't even know that until, I was researching everything to make this presentation. Um, and so, like, why is this group specifically so at risk? And basically, it has to deal with basically how we've treated them throughout history. So since European settlers like arrived to the country, well, to what is now the United States, Native Americans were kind of oppressed in different forms. So we took their land, we forced them onto like reservations that had like subpar land. We like restricted the amount of resources that they would get. We would make treaties with them, and then um, you know not live up to those treaties. And the entire time this was happening, sexual violence was used against Native women as like a fear tactic to show them that they weren't welcome and that the land was for the European settlers and not for them. So that's something that's persisted through history and could be a reason for all of this. So when we talk about racial groups as a whole, like what are the things that make these groups so vulnerable? So let's just go through these one by one. So social stigma within certain groups. I know that for those of you that don't know, I am African American. And I know from experience that anything related to like sexual assault, sexual abuse, like within families, is something that is not really talked about in the Black community. I'm sure in other communities as well. Growing up, I remember like hearing about like things, and people would be like, "Oh, like no, that's like a family issue. Like the family needs to deal with it. We don't need to, get outside help. Like other people don't need to know our business." And that's just something that like it kind of like normalizes it. Like people would say like, "Oh, like Uncle so and so, like he can't, be careful when you're around him." Telling kids to be careful, like, or like girls can't like wear certain things when like certain family members come over, um, and not really, putting all the emphasis on like the children and the people who would be like the victims of something like this, uh, putting all the responsibility on them and never really pressuring the people who are perpetrating. So that's just something like I've noticed within my life, um, within my community. So, the hypersexualization of minorities, you see this throughout history. Like, basically anyone that wasn't viewed as white just was seen as like a super sexual being, and like they just couldn't control their urges. You see this in like a bunch of like movies like Birth of a Nation. If you don't know what that is, basically the premise is it's from like the 1920s, some real old. Basically the premise is there's this like savage black man who just like can't control his urges, and he ends up trying to like go after this pure like white woman, and she's like running away from him, and she ends up like dying like in an effort to get away from him, and this was something that was used like by the KKK to like enforce this notion that like black men were dangerous, they were like super sexual, and like they had to do like everything they could to protect like their pure white women, and stuff like that. So you see that with black people, you see it different races, ethnicities. So it's something that's definitely contributed to um, why we see beautiful minority groups as being, they're people that we don't really think about when we think of like things that happen because of sexual assault, sexual abuse, just because they're viewed as hypersexual beings like in themselves. And then mistrust of law enforcement. You see this throughout a lot of communities of color. Basically, law enforcement in the past has been used as a way to, um, oppress people of color in different ways. And still to this day, there's still instances of, you know, um, police brutality and just like different things from law enforcement that would obviously make anyone not very trusting of them. Um, but that's mostly only applied to people of color and not to like white folks. So mostly white people have like a great trusting of law enforcement. But if you go to like communities of color, it's not the same thing. So that could be a reason why, like, if someone is a victim of sexual violence, they may not report it because the police aren't going to do anything. Um, they don't feel like it's actually worth it to go to law enforcement because nothing good is going to come out of it. Uh, and then we have a history of redlining and discriminatory practices. For those of you who don't know, redlining was basically policies where different like real estate firms would only approve loans to people of color for like in certain areas, uh, basically segregating the country. So that's why you see that a lot of communities of color um, are like in like inner cities, and then there's white communities like in the suburbs outside of the cities. And this was done like deliberately, so that they can keep minorities away from white people. And this also led to like discriminatory practices. So spelled that word wrong. Disregard that. um, So yeah, so like, different resources not being available because of like where you live or your zip code. So there may not be that many resources for survivors of sexual assault in like low income neighborhoods, as opposed to if you go to an upper class neighborhood, they might have uh, a bunch of different resources that can help people. Language barriers, this is something that's really, really big, and a lot of people don't really realize it. Um, so if you think about it, even in talking about like something as traumatic as sexual assault or sexual abuse in your native language that you are very comfortable speaking in, it's sometimes hard. Like there are some survivors who it takes years for them to actually like put into words like how they feel, like what happened to them. So just imagine like having to do that in a different language that's not your native language. Maybe it's not a language that you're comfortable like talking about that thing with, or maybe you just don't even know like what words to use in that language. So it's something that we should definitely like take into account when working with survivors. Um, because if they don't know like how to express themselves, like how are we really going to give them the help that they deserve? And then the last one is sexual violence by dominant groups. So I kind of talked about that earlier with Native Americans. So how like throughout their history, Native Americans were exposed to like sexual violence by like the European settlers, especially Native women. You also see this during slavery. A lot of times, the white masters would rape like the female slaves, and because they in this situation they had like no power, like you know, they were powerless to do anything about it. So it's something that happened for like a very, very long time. All right, so then the next group we're going to talk about is the LGBTQIA plus community. So I'm just going to go through this real quick, what the different facets of this community are. So each letter represents a different subgroup throughout the community. So the L stands for lesbian, and that is two women who are in the relationship. Gay refers to two men, um, men that are attracted to men. Bisexual is a term that's used for people who are attracted to both sexes, both male and female. Um, Trans is a term that is used for an individual whose gender expression is different than the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if at birth you were assigned the gender of male, but like you feel that you are actually female, um, then that's trans, and vice versa. Um, this is like just a very like quick, like brief, basic like definition of all these. So excuse me if I like leave something out, didn't mean to. Um, Queer is has become back in the day it was like a slur to use for this community, but now they are reclaiming the term, and so now queer has come to mean just it's more like an umbrella term of like the LGBT community at large. Um, just for like if there are people who feel like their identity isn't really you know adequately expressed by one of the other letters in the spectrum. Intersex is something that a lot of people don't know about. So intersex individuals are those individuals who biologically have aspects of both male and female. Um, so there's actually a lot more people in the world that are intersex than people think. Um, and it could be just something similar like the level of your hormones that you have, different things like that that can make you intersex. And people don't really realize that's a thing. The term there was like other terms that people used, but they're problematic and we don't use those anymore. So intersex is how you refer to it. And then asexual are those individuals that don't really have a sexual attraction to any gender or anyone in particular. Um, So yeah, so they're not just sexual beings. They don't outwardly show like that attraction to like really anyone that might fall onto the spectrum. So that's the LGBT community, like general view of them. So now we'll get into the statistics. Okay. So we see that the LGBT community experiences higher rates of poverty, stigma, and marginalization. So these are all things that put them at greater risk for sexual assault. Um, so you see here that uh, 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to the 35% of straight women. So here you're just seeing, this group is experiencing um, a higher rate of violence when it comes to sexual violence than their straight counterparts. Um, so yeah, so these are just different statistics. You see throughout all of them, it's mostly like even throughout the LGBT spectrum, you see that it's mostly like women um, that belong to the spectrum that are experiencing this. Um, and the reasons that people would experience, higher rates in this community, or like I said, is for the marginalization. So especially like if you are not, this could be like a hate crime as well. Like sexual violence is also used as a hate crime against people of the LGBT community. Um, and that's not something that you typically see like with like white women or straight people. It's not really like a hate crime, um, but it also could be a hate crime, for the LGBT community. So something we should look out for. And then the big one that we want to talk about is the transgender community. So as you can see, like even with like the LGBT community, there's like subpopulations, and some subpopulations have a higher rate of violence. So within the LGBT community, transgender people and bisexual women face the most the highest rates of sexual violence, um, especially like throughout childhood. Um, so you see that trans women, specifically trans women of color, are typically the most at risk when we talk about sexual violence, not only like within like you know, the LGBT community, but like just the population at large. They are the ones who receive like the highest amounts of not only like sexual violence, but just violence in general. Um, if you look at the rates for violence against trans women, especially trans women of color, specifically Black women, um, last year in 2019, I believe there were 26 deaths, 26 murders of trans women in the United States, most of those being Black trans women. And then I read an article like a week or two ago about the amount of murders in this year, and we're already up to 6, and it's only April. Um, so yeah, you see that trans women, specifically the ones of color, are experiencing like an alarming rate of like violence against them. Um, so yeah, that's something that we should definitely like um, talk about, bring awareness about, and then so we also want to know like why for those survivors, what is stopping them from getting the resources that they need after such a traumatic experience. So you see with the LGBT community, it's can be a lot harder for them to get those resources for a number of different reasons. Mainly if they are not out to their community. Um, Being sexually assaulted might, bring out that layer of their identity that maybe, they're not ready to, share that with everyone. They don't want the whole, it's not the good moment for people to know such an intimate part of their lives. So that may stop survivors from getting help they need. And then you also have to look at, the marginalization and discrimination they might experience. So a lot of times in like more conservative areas, they may not feel comfortable going to someone and like disclosing that they're part of the LGBT community, and that can stop them from getting um, the help, like the therapy, like all the resources that they would need in this situation. And they don't do it because of fear of what else could happen to them, or like, losing those ties with people they love, which they should never be put in that situation. Um, but that's the world we live in, and those are like some struggles that they have to face. Another thing is just being basically disrespected or not believed while getting this help. So like a big thing is, especially with like the transgender community, misgendering them. It's a sign that like, one, you don't respect them, and two, you aren't giving them the agency to identify how they want to be identified. So there could be like trans individuals who they may go to hospital to to get services for something, um, and they just aren't treated correctly, and they just decide that it's not worth them like being put through like so much disrespect, um, you know, to get the services they need. So it's something that we need to be very cognizant of and bring awareness to, and make sure that um, that those from the trans community, can feel comfortable and they feel like, accepted when they're going to get these services that they obviously need. All right, so those were the 8 groups that I was going to talk about. But then there are other groups that I wanted to, talk about too. I won't go into as much detail as the other ones just because we're out of time. Um, but here's some other groups. So undocumented immigrants. Um, so they're at risk because they might not report, because if they report, there's this fear that if they are undocumented, that they might get reported, or that different things can go wrong for them, like in the immigration process, if they were to tell someone about this, um, which is something, it's very wrong in my opinion. I'm not going to go on my little political like rant about like how I feel about immigration, um, but it is very disappointing to see that someone who is a victim of a crime of sexual violence will probably not go to get the help that they need, because they're fearful of like their immigration status or the immigration status of someone else in their family. That should not be a thing, especially because they may have left their country because of sexual violence. So to like go to a different country and then to experience sexual violence, like maybe for another time in your life, and then not being able to get the you know that what you deserve, is kind of like a slap in the face. And then we have homeless individuals. I put especially youth, because homeless youth do experience a lot of sexual violence. And then, this is something that can be experienced because they can be out on the streets. But even sometimes, like when they're in shelters, like there's still times where they can, you know, uh, fall victims to sexual violence uh, in places that they go, because they feel that that's a safe place. Turns out it's not. And then we have disabled individuals, sex workers, trafficking victims. These are people just don't normally think about, especially like sex workers and trafficking victims. Um, People think that because, especially sex workers, because they're in this like line of work, like it's something that should be expected. But like no one, it doesn't matter like what your career is, like what you're doing, um, should be should be getting sexually assaulted. That's just not a thing that should be happening. It doesn't matter if you're a sex worker. It doesn't matter if you're a librarian or a CEO or something. You should never be sexually assaulted at all. And a lot of these people, well, not all of them, but like some people that are involved in sex work, and especially trafficking victims, they're forced into this. This is not something that they want to do. So that already is a type of sexual violence um, that we're not really talking about. And then incarcerated inmates, people that there's people that we just don't think about. If they get disenfranchised in like a bunch of different ways, like if you're a felon, like you might not be able to vote. It's hard to get a job, all these things. So once you get out, like there's all these things that set up against you that can make you, at risk to like reoffend or become like a victim of some other crime. That includes like sexual violence. And even while they're like incarcerated, they can experience sexual violence. It could be from other inmates. It could even be from like the correctional staff. So there's a lot of things like um, that we don't think about when we think of incarcerated individuals. We just think, oh, they did something, they get locked up, whatever happens to them, but it's not really the case. And I know for like incarcerated individuals, there's the PREA law, which is I think it's the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and I don't know all the specifics of this act because I'm not like a legal advocate. Our legal advocates know all way more about it than I do. But basically, it's a law that basically allows for inmates to get um, resources if they are, you know, survivors or victims of sexual assault while they're incarcerated. So that's a step in the right direction, but need you a little bit. All right. So we talked about these different groups, and now we're going to talk about like what it is about these groups that has made them so underrepresented when we talk about sexual assault. So when we talked about racial and ethnic minorities, it's in part due to institutional racism. So institutional racism, like when people we talk about it, it's a systematic distribution of resources, powers, and opportunity in our society that benefit people of a certain racial group. So when people think about racism, they think, oh, like someone calling someone a slur, or like discrimination based on like your skin color and all these things, and that is part of it. But institutional racism is like the bigger picture. Like, what is it that like our government and like different agencies, different like institutions that we've like created as a society, how is it that they can be racist? They can be racist. Like, what have they done in the past to minorities of color, and what are they doing now? So you see it. The big one is like the criminal justice system, how there's been multiple studies that show like the disparities between like minorities and white people, even though like they commit crimes at the same exact levels, but for some reason, which the reason is racism, uh, minorities and people of color are more represented like in the correctional system. They're being punished for this. We're doing it at the same rate that other people are doing. Uh, so that's something that can this institutional racism can also bleed over to um, crisis work. You know, people may be hesitant to like go into like you know uh, minority neighborhood because they might feel like it's unsafe. It's uh, it's not a good place to be. Like they don't feel safe. The people aren't gonna come. Like all this stuff. Um, so that's something that we have to like work through and realize that our services should be open to everyone, no matter like what their race is, like where they live, all that. So keep that in mind. And then sexism. We all know about sexism when we talk sexual violence. What sexism is. The discrimination or prejudice against an individual or group based on the idea that one sex or gender is better than the other. And that goes right along with toxic masculinity at the bottom. So it's this belief that we have as society that men are superior, they're the superior sex, um, and that they hold all the power um, within our society. Obviously, we know that's not true, um, but this is something that's been used throughout like all of history to oppress women. And then when you talk about toxic masculinity is the adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions boys and men may comfortably express. Um, so yeah, that's part of the reason why male survivors aren't, given the space to, talk about their experiences with sexual assault. Um, it's that belief that men are strong, and like they can't be emotional. They're not allowed to show any type of weakness. They aren't really allowed to show emotions other than like anger. Uh, and it's something that's very damaging because you're not able to fully express yourself in a human way. Like you have to guard and suppress like different things that you have, which it's healthy to talk about those and have those emotions and work through them. But if you're just not talking about them, how are you going to get the help that you need? And the big thing about toxic masculinity is it's not only something that men can be perpetrators of, women can be perpetrators of it too. Um, you know, it's that adherence to like those traditional roles. So forcing those roles on like men and women, saying that you know, women can't be aggressive, they can't show anger, they have to be like polite and all this. Um, that's also toxic as well. Like, stereotyping and like putting people into these boxes that may not necessarily fit them. If you're a man and want to adhere to these traditional roles, or you're a woman you want to adhere to them, that's perfectly fine. But the thing is, you shouldn't be forced to do it. You also shouldn't force other people to do it. And then the last thing is heterosexism, and that's the ideological system that denies, uh, generates, and stigmatizes any non-heterosexual form of behavior, identity, relationship, or community. So that's what's happening to the LGBT community. We live in a heteronormative society. So if you're not a straight person, you automatically just don't have the power in the society. You're looked at as like something's wrong with you, like you're different, you're weird, like this isn't normal. And that's not the case. We know that sexuality and like gender expression, it comes on a spectrum. There's no right or wrong way to be. Everyone's different. People love in different ways, so it's fine. It doesn't matter, uh, what your orientation is. You're human. You have rights, and you deserve like the same access to it as everyone else. So these are like just some. They're not all the systems of oppressions. If we talked about that, I'd be here for like another like 200 years. But these are some of the like systems of oppression um, that we see throughout society, and specifically ones that overlap with sexual assault. Um, so yeah, so why are we talking about that? Because if we're going to be a rape crisis center, if we're going to be working with those survivors and those victims who need our services and need to get the help that they need because of these traumatic situations, we have to think about it in a very intersectional like way. So intersectionality, so as you don't know, is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, and it's regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantages. So when we talk about intersectionality, it basically means that when someone presents themselves, um, we have to look at like what all their identities are and how that can affect um, how they navigate through the world. So, as rape crisis advocates, we need to, have like a basic understanding of race, of class, and gender, and how that'll apply to someone who's going through, who's a victim or survivor of sexual violence, and how those different identities that they have can affect their experience. And not just focusing on um, the experiences that we are comfortable with or like we know the most about or the ones that are dominant. Um, Making sure that every facet of like someone's identity is like fully addressed when getting them help that they need. Because if you have a different people with different identities have different experiences, so you want to make sure that all those experiences are taken into account. We're victim centered, so we need to do what's in the best interest of the victim and what they want to do. So we need to understand like where they're coming from, how their identity plays a part. And then there's a second video I had. It just goes, more into what intersectionality is. Um, Basically what I said, but a lot more academic. Probably sounding better, but that's what it is. Like I said, these videos will be in the comments of the Facebook post, so you just go ahead and look at those. And then one of the last things I want to talk about or just bring up is this quote, and it's from Angela Davis from her book Women, Culture, and Politics. For those of you who don't know who Angela Davis is, she's a civil rights activist. She since the 60s, she's literally just been writing about like different forms of oppression. She's one of my favorite like activists. And I really like her because she talks about different things, not just racism, but she talks about different things like prison industrial complex, sexism, colonialism, different things like that. So she has like a good like knowledge of like how of intersectionality and like how all these systems like work together to oppress people who aren't white, heteronormative, Christian, like all those things. So yeah, so this is a quote from her. It says, "The roots of sexism and homophobia are found in the same economic and political institutions that serve as the foundation of racism in this country, and more often than not, the same extremist circles that inflict violence of people of color are responsible for the eruptions of violence inspired by sexism. Our political activism must clearly manifest our understanding of these connections." Uh, so I really like this quote. It pretty much everything I was talking about um, into into a good conclusion. And it just says, if we're going to address like one form of oppression, we also have to acknowledge and address the other forms. So because we're working on sexism and sexual violence, we need to be cognizant of homophobia, racism, uh, classism, ableism, like all those things, if we're going to adequately give the survivors and victims what they need. Yeah. So that's pretty much all I have for this presentation. I'm sorry if there's a bunch of like dings going on in these. I'm doing this on my computer and everyone wants to send me emails, so it's just been dinging. Um, so I apologize for that if that's something that is popping up. And then the last slide I have on here are just some resources that I came across while doing research for this presentation. Um, so I tried to find a mix of like local ones to Southwestern Illinois and St. Louis area, as well as like national ones. Um, so the Anti-Violence Project, it's a nonprofit wow, I made a lot of errors in here. Disregard that, y'all. Uh, it's a nonprofit that serves people of the LGBTQ community, and they have like a national hotline. So any violence that happens in that community, that's a place that you can go, you talk about it, get the help that you need. There's a hotline number, and the thing about it, it's bilingual as well. So the Trans Woman of Color Collective, this organization, I went on their website and found it, and basically they just provide like information about the struggles of trans women of color. So like you go in there and you can find out more information. Like you can like, ask for a speaker to come out. Blah, blah, blah. It's a national organization and they have different like regions. So you just have to go to your region and see what resources they have. Malesurvivors.org is a cool website I found, and it's basically it's a site for male survivors to go and find resources that they may need. Uh, so like, a lot of like male survivors may not be comfortable like going to like a certain, place for like some odd reason. That's totally fine. Go on this website. It like works with you. It'll find places that accept your insurance. If that's an issue, like things in your area. So that's good. RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, is where I got a lot of the statistics from. They operate a national hotline, so there's a number right there you can use. And then for some more local resources, the YWCA in Alton, and then also the one in St. Louis. I have the numbers here. Um, yeah, they just have different like programs and different like things that they do to help like women and minorities and different groups. So they're someone to call, and of course, call for help. So there's our number that is our 24-hour hotline. So even like during the COVID situation, our hotline is still running, so you can still call it, get the help that you need, and we'll do our best to help you out. So yeah, so this is my webinar. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you learned something new. Um, you can, if there's something like you want to know, um, try to reach out to me. I'm not like expert on all of these things. I just read books, so that's why I know about this. But yeah, like there's so many resources. Anything by Angela Davis is like a good thing to look at if you're like trying to talk about oppression or anything, learn more about oppression in all its forms. So yeah, um, yeah, just research if you want to some more, and hope this was good. So alrighty, thank you. Oh, before I go, if you guys are watching this on Wednesday, Friday, I'll be going live on our Facebook group. So it'll just be like a summary of everything that's going on this week. So we'll talk about the media that was posted on Monday. We'll go over a little bit about the book that I read on Tuesday. We'll do a little summary of this presentation, and if you guys want, we can have a discussion, ask me questions, do my best to answer them. Yeah, just interact with everyone. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. Y'all have a great day. Stay safe.